If you want to learn everything about atomic bombs in World War II, how they were created, how they were used, my book Atomo Como Arma is for you, okay? It's available on WeClap and also on Amazon, but if you want your autographed copy, just send me an email here with your zip code so I can calculate the shipping. Here's another question from one of our members, this time from Luis Sergio Grossi, who sent this in. Good morning, my friend. What's your opinion? In the scenario where the Germans had occupied Moscow before the harshest winter, what would have been the outcome of Operation Barbarossa? And maybe the war as a whole could have been different, could have turned out differently. Take care. Taking Moscow before winter, in my opinion, okay? It has to be a specific window of time. It can't be just any window, right? In other words, if it's not during the harshest part of winter, like Grossi said here, it could have been, for example, in November at the beginning of winter. I don't think it would change anything, okay? Or it would change very little in the end. Why? Because I just set a date like that. Very important. In the middle of the second half of 1941 is a real turning point, right? That date is October 7, 1941. Because on that date, October 7, 1941, in the middle of that avalanche that was Operation Barbarossa, still the German advance against Moscow, we had there in Washington the signing of the Soviet Union joining the Lend-Lease program, right? And then I'll tell you this. I know what you might be thinking, right? But Lend-Lease didn't influence anything in 1941. Hold on. Lend-Lease, it came in gradually, right? Little by little. It really kicked in like at the end of 1942, beginning of 1943. But that's not it, right? I'm not referring to that. I'm talking about the political backing. The political backing that Stalin started to enjoy from that date on. From that date on, Stalin was much more at ease to commit all his reserve divisions and all his ammunition depots, everything he had on the front line, because he knew there was much more coming his way. He didn't know when, but he knew it was coming. So, from that point on, Stalin was able not only to solidify his position as a leader in the context of the Soviet Union, but also to give more freedom to frontline commanders like Georgy Zhukov, who organized the defense of Moscow. He gave the guy more freedom so he could stand his ground and say, look, we're not leaving here. It doesn't matter how many casualties or losses we have. Right? So here's the thing. I think that if the capture of Moscow happens after that, let's say a few weeks later, I don't think it's going to change much.
Os alemães vão tomar a cidade.
The situation of the Soviet Union will extend into 1942. And it's quite possible that we'll have a similar outcome to what we had in our timeline, with some differences, maybe a few more months, perhaps. I'm going to talk, of course, about the logistical importance of Moscow for coordinating the Soviet war effort. But we'll see that politics at the top here really shape how news like this is perceived, right? You remember that in our timeline on November 7th, 30 days after the signing, November 7th, Stalin held a troop parade here, right? The troops that had arrived from Siberia, right? He held a parade with these troops here in Red Square. And then these troops went to the front line, leaving from Red Square, marching in the direction you see in this photo, right? Towards St. Basil's Cathedral, and they pass by there. They split up, I believe, but most of them go between the Kremlin and St. Basil's Cathedral. There's a big bridge there. Well, what do I think, man? I think that if this fall of Moscow had happened before the signing of the Lend-Lease, it could have had a much bigger influence on how things unfolded, okay? And then you have to understand the following. The Soviet Union, in that period before the signing of the Lend-Lease, wouldn't have had such a solid relationship with the United States. This photo here, for example, shows Vyacheslav Molotov when he made the trip, the first trip of a Soviet leader to the United States in May of 42. Molotov went to talk to Roosevelt from a country that had barely been recognized by the United States in the previous years. So the situation of the Soviet Union during this period was already much more solid. But what would have become of the Soviet Union before that, right? I want to show you the map of Operation Barbarossa so we can understand where I'm going with this. You can see here the starting line of the offensive on June 22nd, and here this solid blue line on August 25th. That's still the end of summer, man. Seriously, it's still the end of summer. And look at Moscow here. Let me zoom in so you can see. In this area here, look where the Army Group Center operates, right? Look at how the Army Group Center, between this line and this line here, how it advanced in such a way. Brutal. How it advanced in an almost unstoppable way, right? Until it captured Smolensk. And Smolensk is captured on July 31st. The point is that Smolensk gets captured. Look at this, Smolensk. Smolensk was considered, in the German military planning as halfway between the starting point and Moscow. You can see here, look, a line. Draw a line from Suwałk here, passing through Smolensk until it reaches Moscow. You can see that in practice it's not exactly halfway. It's closer to Moscow than to the starting point, right? But the Germans considered Smolensk to be halfway. To get here, it took about 6 weeks of fighting, from June 22nd to July 31st. 6 weeks of fighting. The area here is smaller, but the German logistics will be worse, right? So, would keeping the pressure the way it was being applied up to this point against Moscow, with both panzer groups here. Look, Panzer Group 2, led by Guderian, and Panzer Group 3, led by Hoth. Instead of on August 21, 1941, in our timeline, they were diverted, one to the north and one to the south. If they had gone straight here, look, to Moscow, and if they had kept the original direction, is it possible that with 6 more weeks, Moscow would have been in the sights of the Germans? I mean, around mid-September. Because you will remember that Guderian turned south here because there was this wedge here. Look, from the Red Army with the armies of Potapov, Lasso, and Kuznetsov here, south of the Pripyat marshes, which really worried Hitler. And another fact was that the Wehrmacht encountered a second wave of Red Army troops there and realized that the final blow could not be delivered yet in 1941. Hitler, therefore, turned the main focus of the offensive to economic objectives, which would be here in Ukraine and also the Caucasus, right? Meaning food and oil. Thus, demoting Moscow to a secondary objective, right? But guys, this is a photo of Moscow in 1941 in September.
Yep.
It's Tverskaya Street, right? Tverskaya Avenue, one of the main ones in the city. And you can see that the weather is still clear. There's a blue sky here. And this would pretty much be what the city and the weather would look like if the Germans had reached Moscow in mid-September. Let's say the second half of September. It would be a totally different situation from the one they faced at the beginning of December when they actually got there. Already after a rainy season, right? Which in October and November covered the Soviet Union. And also after the beginning of winter when the ground hardened. But then the cold also hit the German soldiers really hard, who weren't prepared for that. They weren't logistically prepared for that. Warm clothing hadn't been distributed, okay? So here, in this sense, at this point, if Moscow had been reached in mid-September, the Red Army defending Moscow also wouldn't have been the same Red Army that defended Moscow in December. Why? Because of this guy right here. Look, it was on September 14th that this guy here, Richard Sorge, a German communist, a spy for the Soviet Union who was living in Japan, it was on this date, September 14th, that Richard Sorge sent the most important message of his life, of his career, to the Kremlin. He said that Japan had decided at the highest level that it did not intend to start planning an invasion of the Soviet Union until Moscow fell. As long as Moscow did not fall, Japan would not invade the Union. Conclusion. Stalin withdrew from the Far Eastern District, the Far Eastern Military District of the Soviet Union, right, Vladivostok, and the border with Manchuria, withdrew 40 divisions. And these 40 divisions approximately 500,000 men were taken by railway to the west, to the front near Moscow. It was this group, this troop contingent that defended Moscow. But if the Germans had reached Moscow back in September, Sorge's report wouldn't have been worth anything, right? Because the city would already be under attack. And then you would still have to release those troops from there if that decision was made. Because it's really difficult, right? Since there was still the threat of a Japanese invasion, especially with the city being attacked. So it's quite possible that the defense of Moscow wouldn't have been as cohesive and as determined as it actually was, especially because there was already a whole plan to move the government from Moscow to Kuibyshev. Okay? So Kuibyshev, which is now Samara, if I remember correctly, would receive Stalin's government, would receive the entire cabinet, the entire Supreme Soviet. Everything had already been prepared to move the capital to Kuibyshev or Samara. In this way, I don't think it's impossible that Moscow could have fallen in 1941 after a continued dismantling. Right of the Red Army, since the ground in front of Moscow, during this hypothetical advance of the Wehrmacht in August and September up to Moscow, would not yet have turned into the mud that it became 30 days later. That's what I think today, okay? Very well. And what is Moscow really worth in the hands of the Germans? You might ask yourself, but would it be worth taking Moscow? Why? Because Moscow. The government, right? You even said that the government had already decided to leave Moscow for Samara, so you take the city, and that's it. You keep the city. Historically, wasn't there Napoleon's invasion? Who took Moscow? And even so, the Russian government resisted. And in the end, Napoleon was defeated? Yes. At that time, the capital wasn't Moscow. The capital was St. Petersburg, Petrograd, right? Moscow was just another city. Important, yes, but it was just another city. But now we have to see that this here, look, man, Russia rail map, this is really important, right? This really factors in a lot, which wasn't a factor in 1812. The railway map of Russia. And is this a current railway map of Russia? Yes. But we can assume that at the time in 1941 it was a bit smaller than this. But its logistics, its whole structure wasn't much different. Look at this here. How the Russian and formerly Soviet railway system really depended on Moscow. It still does, right? It's really all centralized in Moscow. And you can see several rail junctions here, right? Which probably didn't exist at the time. These railways were probably all really centralized in Moscow, which was the main railway hub from Eastern Russia to Western Russia. And man, taking over Moscow's railway center, which the Wehrmacht depends on, but also the Red Army depends on because Russia doesn't have good roads, right? Russia doesn't have good highways. Back then it didn't. This would really be a blow because you take away the enemy's ability to transfer troop contingents to the south. Look at this map here and see if you can find viable alternatives to defend Ukraine, for example, with material that arrives there from Murmansk. How are you going to make this transfer work without this nerve center in Moscow? Of course, the logistics would be seriously affected, right? It's also obvious that we can talk about the political impact of having swastika flags flying over the Kremlin, right? Large red banners with swastikas decorating the Kremlin wall, St. Basil's Cathedral, all of that. Of course, that would have a huge media impact. Just like the swastika flying over the Eiffel Tower, right? Everyone saw that and said, wow, Germany is on top, right? Germany already won. A lot of people said Germany won. A swastika above the Eiffel Tower? And what if the swastika flew over the Kremlin? What would happen to the international support Russia would receive? How would Russia be seen internationally? With a symbol that big being broken?
né?
With the Germans destroying the red stars of the Kremlin, the 5 red stars of the Kremlin, breaking them, throwing them down from above. Didn't they do that with symbols from other countries? With the Polish eagles, for example? Of course they were going to film that, cutting those stars down, making them fall to the ground, and replacing them with a swastika up there. I mean, it would be a major propaganda coup. Wouldn't it? So, would it mean that the Soviet Union would collapse instantly? No, it doesn't. But would it be a huge blow? It would. Also, because I want you to analyze this other map here. This is a demographic map showing the population density of the Soviet Union. Look at the population distribution in the Soviet Union. And see if by looking at this map here, you can figure out the reason behind the German plan to establish the so-called AA line. AA line. Is it the AA line? It's the Archangelsk-Astrakhan line. Look, this line here. This line here would be the furthest advance the Germans intended to make. Look at what's over here past this line. Basically, the entire Russian population. So whoever controlled this eastern area beyond Astrakhan and Archangelsk would end up as a vast, sparsely populated region. Did you get it? And how would that impact the Soviet Union in 1942?
42.
Maybe a capture of Moscow before the signing of Lend-Lease would cause Lend-Lease to be delayed. or it would keep the United States-Russia alliance from reaching the level it did. Maybe Stalin's position would have been weakened if he had retreated to Samara. Maybe a coup d'etat, as many researchers consider or imagine. Maybe a coup within the highest circle of power, this time in Samara, would have removed Stalin from power in order to negotiate some kind of deal with the Germans. In this situation, with Moscow captured, I would bet that, since the events could be independent, the United States could still be attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor, since at that time Japan had already made the decision to attack Pearl Harbor. So maybe one event wouldn't impact the other. And with the United States in the war, at the beginning of 1942, the Soviet Union and Germany could reach an agreement. An agreement in which the Germans would get a large piece of land, but the Soviet Union would survive as a nation. What for? So that Hitler could focus on fighting the United States. A lot of people already consider this. I've even read it in several forums. It's a possibility, right? I believe it's a path that could have been taken. But would the fall of Moscow lead to the immediate collapse of the Soviet Union? Personally, I really doubt it. But it would open the door to events quite different from those we know. And then, do you agree or disagree with me? Have you considered this scenario before? Tell us in the comments below. If you like this video, then share it with your friends, but also give us a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to Sala de Guerra so you don't miss anything else. I'll stop here. Thank you again for watching, and here's a big hug from Sala de Guerra.